crossing the oceans is the ultimate challenge for serious sailors. Some even sail around the world alone. One of these was Briton Lisa Clayton in 1995. But others have challenged the oceans in more extreme ways. Sometimes this has been through misfortune. In November 1942, a British merchant vessel was torpedoed in the South Atlantic by a German U-boat. The crew took to their lifeboats. Hong Kong-born Poon Lim found himself alone on a raft. 133 days later, he was rescued by a Brazilian fishing vessel and was still fit enough to walk ashore. His survival record has never been surpassed. Likewise, in 1973, husband and wife Morris and Marilyn Bailey had their yacht sunk in a Pacific storm. They were reduced to drifting in a tiny inflatable dinghy. 118 days later, they were rescued by a South Korean fishing vessel. This took the Baileys to Honolulu in the Hawaiian Islands. It was the plight of the shipwrecked which motivated a young French doctor, Alain Bombard, to undertake an epic voyage in 1952. He was convinced that the sea could provide sufficient food for victims to survive for considerable lengths of time. His vessel was a horseshoe-shaped inflatable dinghy with a simple sail. This he named the Hérétique. Bombard unveiled his craft in May 1952. But most people thought that he was mad. Nevertheless, he and a friend carried out a successful trial in the Mediterranean. Then, on the 19th of November, 1952, Bombard set out from the Cape Verde Islands to cross the Atlantic to the French island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. He returned to France a hero, having reached Barbados in the West Indies after 67 days of extreme hardship, during which he lost 35 pounds in weight. But his findings were to save many lives. Rafts have proved to be a popular, unconventional means of crossing the oceans. Much of the inspiration for this was Norwegian Thor Heyerdahl's epic Pacific voyage on the balsa wood raft Kon-Tiki in 1947. He and his crew of 5 sailed 4,300 miles from the Peruvian port of Callao to Polynesia in 100 days. It was a voyage that caught the imagination of the world. A more ambitious but equally successful voyage using balsa wood rafts took place in 1973. Led by Spaniard Vital Halsa, 12 men from 7 countries set out on 3 rafts to sail from Ecuador to Australia. During their 6-month voyage, their food ran short, and they were forced to subsist on raw fish. Nevertheless, after drifting 6,600 miles, they reached the coast of New South Wales. They were taken in tow after adverse currents prevented them from reaching the shore. American W. Veer Baker must be the most persistent raft sailor. A shipbuilder during the Second World War, he built a raft in its aftermath called Lehigh. His plan was to sail around the world with a message of peace to all nations. Baker's first leg was to be a voyage across the Pacific, from California to Tahiti. He was, however, to find himself constantly thwarted. But this all lay in the future, when he was towed out of San Francisco into the open waters of the ocean. At first, all went well for Baker and his crew. But then a storm blew up. Lehigh was soon in difficulties. Luckily, a passing vessel was on hand to rescue the raft's crew. Veer Baker was undeterred. He was determined to try again. And work was got underway on Lehigh too. Once more, Baker passed under San Francisco's Golden Gate. Again, when the raft reached the open seas and the currents which Baker hoped would drive it towards Tahiti, Lehigh was cast adrift. The sea was initially calm. But then the wind began to get up. The swell caused Lehigh to become ever more waterlogged. Baker was forced to transmit a distress call. He and his crew were rescued by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter. Lehigh too became the house of a homeless Mexican family. Nevertheless, Baker was still fired by his ambition. And Lehigh 3 was born. Baker did his best to ensure that she was more seaworthy than her predecessors. Perhaps it would be third time lucky. But this was not to be. Again, Baker had to be rescued. Lehigh 3 was officially declared to be unseaworthy. And so Lehigh 4 was built. She looked more robust than her three namesakes. The raft set sail in July 1958. This time, Baker took some Polynesians with him. The wind stood fair. Even Baker's dog enjoyed life on board. Lehigh 4 made good progress, and to help pass the time, Baker had brought with him a submersible chamber so that the crew could observe life under the surface of the ocean. The wind and the currents propelled the raft ever further westwards, but not towards Tahiti. Eventually, after 67 days at sea, the crew sighted Hawaii. Veer Baker's persistence was finally rewarded. He reflected,
"Well, it was a crude old raft, but if it could focus attention on peace and help just a little bit, then I'd be happy. I wanted a symbol of all the old voyagers who had sailed to the New World and built a great civilization. But I also wanted to tell our present generation that we had to learn from the mistakes that these people had made, or destroy ourselves too."
Ele foi astrônomo, físico e matemático. Sua
1980, Severin embarked on an even more ambitious project, albeit in warmer waters. This was to sail a replica of an ancient Arab dhow from the Sheikhdom of Oman at the head of the Red Sea to China. Sohar, as his vessel was called, proved to be remarkably seaworthy. The international crew soon learned to handle her and to navigate by the ancient Arab method of using the stars. Calling in at Singapore, the voyage to China took 8 months. In the 1960s, a new craze developed, rowing the oceans. First to achieve an Atlantic crossing were Captain John Ridgway and Sergeant Shea Blythe of the British Army's Parachute Regiment. They set out from Massachusetts in English rows on the 26th of May, 1967. "92 days later, they arrived at Kilronan in the Irish Aran Islands. The first lone oarsman to achieve the crossing was another Briton, John Fairfax. He rowed from Las Palmas in the Canaries to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in Britannia, in the course of 180 days between January and July 1969. Fairfax's girlfriend, Sylvia Cook, was there to greet him on his arrival, as were thousands of enthusiastic Americans. Fairfax and Cook would soon embark on an even more ambitious voyage. But while Fairfax was doing his row, the first solo west-east crossing of the Atlantic was being made by SAS man Tom McLean. He started from St. John's, Newfoundland, and rowed for 72 days, suffering neither seasickness nor even blisters to his hands. On the 27th of July, 1969, he made a landfall in Black Sod Bay on Ireland's west coast. He was later given a rousing reception by his SAS comrades, and his excellent physical shape was apparent. Meanwhile, John Fairfax and Sylvia Cook were getting ready for their new project, which was nothing less than rowing the Pacific.
But with a bit of luck, we'll make it.
The couple rowed out of San Francisco in May 1971. Their target was Australia, 8,000 miles away. Nearly 12 months later, they arrived off the coast of Queensland after experiencing many adventures, including a near shipwreck and a bad shark bite to Fairfax's arm. Sadly, their romance did not survive the voyage, although they were to remain friends and write a bestseller on their incredible row. Another British oarsman now took the stage. Peter Bird had begun by rowing the Atlantic with friends in 1974. After it, he vowed never to risk his life in such a way again. But his restless spirit drove him to break the vow. In 1980, Bird left San Francisco aiming to row alone to Australia, but was shipwrecked in Hawaii. 2 years later, he tried again in a new boat, Hele Ono Britannia, which is Hawaiian for Get Going Britannia. San Francisco was again his starting point. Bird made steady progress. On Christmas Day, he even dressed up as Santa Claus and gave himself presents. Eventually, he approached Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which was almost impossible to get through. An Australian warship came to pick him up after 294 days alone at sea. Sadly, however, Get Going Britannia broke up as she was being towed back to port. Then, in 1991, Frenchman Gérard d'Abbeville set about conquering the northern Pacific. His plan was to row from Choshi in Japan to San Francisco. But his departure was delayed, and he eventually set out in mid-July, when the weather was about to enter the typhoon season. Nevertheless, d'Abbeville's boat Sector was well equipped. He soon struck stormy weather, and many times Sector turned turtle. But d'Abbeville was always able to right her through use of his ballast tanks. He kept going, but noticed that the currents were driving him well north of San Francisco. He did have a radio on board, and aircraft flew out to monitor his progress. On he rowed, ever further eastwards, maintaining his planned rate of 7,000 strokes per day. Eventually, battered and bruised by the storms he had been through, d'Abbeville began to close on North America. His spirits rose, in spite of further rough weather. His landfall was to be Washington State, and he arrived at Ilasco on the 21st of November 1991, after 133 days at sea. He said, "I did not conquer the Pacific. It let me go across." But his success now caused a debate as to who really had achieved the first Pacific solo row. Peter Bird.
I do feel a little sorry for Gerard if he's rowed the Pacific and has gone all that way thinking that he was going to be the first, only to arrive at the other end and found out that he isn't.
At bottom was the question as to whether the Great Barrier Reef is part of Australia's coast or not. Bird decided to end the argument by rowing the Northern Pacific from Russia to North America. During 1992 and 1993, he made no less than 3 attempts, but every time he was beaten by the weather, although on the last he achieved a record by spending 305 days alone at sea. In 1996, Bird had reached the age of 49, but was still determined to realize his dream. He set off from Vostochny, near Vladivostok, on the 26th of March in the redesigned and sleeker Sector 2. It was to be Peter Bird's last voyage. After 68 days at sea, a distress signal from him was picked up. A search found his damaged boat, but there was no sign of Peter Bird. There have been some even odder craft used in ocean crossing attempts, including this 1919 paddle boat contraption. It sprang a leak as soon as it entered the water. In 1950, Australian engineer Bob Carlin and his American girlfriend Eleanor crossed the Atlantic in an amphibious jeep called Half Safe, in a bid to sell the design to a car manufacturer. Half Safe created much public interest in Europe, but Carlin failed to achieve a commercial sale of his idea. Accompanied by another American girl, he continued round the world, arriving back in Canada in 1958. But even conventional boat voyages have had a bizarre twist to them. Frenchman Bernard Moitessier was one of the entrants in the first solo circumnavigation race, held in 1969. He set out from Plymouth in his ketch on the 22nd of August and made good progress as he sailed south down the Atlantic. He then passed South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. It became clear that Moitessier was leading the race and was likely to win the Golden Globe trophy. But Moitessier was becoming increasingly wrapped up in his solitude and was enjoying having just the company of the sea. He approached South America and rounded Cape Horn. then, to the consternation of the world, instead of turning north for home, Moitessier continued eastwards. It was as if he was pursuing a rainbow, one that would eventually lead him to Tahiti after a record-breaking non-stop voyage of nearly 38,000 miles. Other yachtsmen, like American Roger Manry in 1965, have tried to sail the smallest boat across the oceans. Manry's Tinkerbell was just 13 feet long. Yet she managed to cross the Atlantic in just 77 days. The people of the English southwest port of Falmouth turned out in force to greet the man who had conquered the Atlantic in such a cheeky manner. But nearly 20 years later, in 1983, former SAS man and Atlantic rower Tom McLean achieved the same feat in an even more impossibly small boat. Gildspur, which was just 7 feet 9 inches long. He arrived off Oporto on the Portuguese coast after sailing 64 days from Newfoundland. Just as bizarre was McLean's 1990 transatlantic voyage in a boat shaped like a bottle. Whether it had a message in it is not recorded. "1994, however, witnessed the strangest of all voyages to date, when Frenchman Guy Delage decided to swim the Atlantic. He had with him a high-tech raft, from which he sent an endless stream of fax messages to his control headquarters in France. Delage also spent much time on the telephone, but the French media were cynical.
He is on a boat, and or near a boat. He is tied to this boat with a rope, you know, and when he swims, between brackets, you know, he is going slower than the boat, you know, because the boat follows the tide.
Nevertheless, Delage did swim on and arrived at the West Indies island of Barbados after 56 days. It was a bizarre voyage, but perhaps even stranger ways of challenging the oceans are still to come.